Alright, in this week's video I will be changing the PCV valve in my 2005 Honda Pilot. I'm doing this because I noticed the engine was having difficulty pulling any of the air through the front valve cover. So I'm going to try the PCV valve and see if that does the trick. This is a 10mm socket, and that is the only one you need to remove the PCV valve, located right there near the dipstick. It's not too difficult to reach, just using the ratchet. The radiator fan is a little bit in the way, but it's not too onerous to get at. Once you break it free with the ratchet, I found that you just reach down and unscrew it by hand without any issues. And there's the bolt holding in the PCV valve. Now, I have a lot of problems getting this PCV valve out of the valve cover. I try moving it back and forth by hand. It's pretty stuck in there. I try to sort of slide a small chisel in between the PCV valve and the valve cover. I don't have too much luck with that. I do sort of start getting it moving by hand with quite a bit of difficulty. And again, try to use the chisel to sort of get a little bit of separation between the valve cover and the PCV valve. Ultimately, I'm going to snap this PCV valve off in the valve cover, which you're going to see here in just a second. So one more attempt to rotate it by hand, hoping to loosen it up. And now I'm going to tap on it with this chisel, and here we go. There, now it's snapped off in the valve cover. No big deal. What I'm going to do here is remove the valve cover. There's only 5 bolts holding it on. There's 2 sort of front and center. I'm taking off sort of the left hand one there, and there's the right hand side from the 2 front center bolts. Now I would like to point out I did try to use my tap and die set to remove the broken off valve, PCV valve from the valve cover with the valve cover on the engine. I just couldn't get a good angle with the taps to thread it in there and pull the valve out. And here's the top left bolt holding in the valve cover. The only bolt that's a little bit difficult to get at is the sort of the top center one, just because some of the upper air intake's in the way. So there's the PCV valve broken off, and I'm going to use a tap to thread in there and then yank it out. So there it is, the snapped off portion, and you can see the tap that I used. Basically just threaded it in and yanked it backwards, and it all came out no issue. So here's the new PCV valve that I picked up at Honda. The cost on this was $44 Canadian, and you can see where the PCV valve slides into the valve cover. So it slides into place, push it in, and obviously, ideally you would want to do this with the valve cover still on the engine and not having to remove it. And the bolt just goes in by hand. I don't have a torque spec on this, but obviously the PCV valve is plastic, so I'm just, about 4 foot-pounds of force. So the next step of this process is just to put everything back together. So I'm going to put the valve cover back on. So you can see me using a longer extension and a longer socket, and I could actually sort of thread it between the air intake and the valve cover without any issues for that top center bolt. So nothing additional has to come off. Basically, I'm just getting the bolts in sort of loosely, and then I'm going to take a torque wrench, and the torque specification on the bolts for the valve cover is 104 inch-pounds. Now you don't want to go straight to 104 inch-pounds on each of them. Basically, I went to about 80 inch-pounds, then 90 inch-pounds, and then up to the 104 inch-pounds on each of the bolts. However, despite kind of going in slowly and bringing them up to the torque spec, I have another tragedy in this job, and I do in fact snap one of the bolts off. So there you go, that was snapped off in the cylinder head. I was able to get it out just by inserting the bolt back into the hole and turning it back out until I could grip it. So Another tragedy in this job. Anyway, I went to the scrapyard and I picked up a whole bolt set for $1.25 and put the valve cover back on with the new bolts. So the next step of assembly, now that the valve cover is back on, one day later, is to put the spark plug rail back on. So it's got the 3 plugs that go to your coils, and it's got 2 additional plugs on the driver's side that connect to your O2 sensors for your front bank. These 2 little bolts, again, I don't have a torque spec, but just snug them up. And a little difficult to see because you got to reach down fairly deep, but they're the O2 sensor, sensor number 2, as well as the sensor number 1 also connects to this wiring harness on the driver's side of the engine. So there you can see there's sensor number 1's connection. Sensor 2 is deeper, and there's the 3 bolts that secure the ignition coils, and they simply insert into the spark plug well and are secured with the 1 bolt. Now that bolt is a 6mm hex to tighten it up, and I'm just using a socket. Once it's tightened up, you can put the wiring harness back onto the ignition coil. And essentially it's the same procedure for the front 3. Insert the ignition coil, tighten up the bolt, and reattach the electrical connector. Now once that's done, just reinstall the engine oil dipstick into the valve cover and reattach the vacuum hose to the front valve cover. And obviously there's a small retaining clip for the vacuum hose. Make sure that that goes back on as well. Once that's all back together, it's time to give it a startup and make sure that everything's working and you got no leaks. And the vehicle fires up without any issue, and everything looks like it's put back together. Now, doing it yourself, I saved about 1 hour of labor from Honda, which is about $165 here. You know, obviously I had a lot of problems with this one, but ultimately it went back together without any issues. If your PCV valve were to be able to be removed from your engine without breaking off, this would be a very easy job. If you end up breaking your PCV valve off, it is more involving, but it's still quite doable. Anyway, thanks for checking out my video, and don't forget to like and subscribe.